So let's suppose we have this flow, and we heard a lot about flow, and now everyone knows by now, I guess, that how to design a flow strategy. We have learned that a couple of minutes ago. But ideas are flowing, but I guess leaders are not really rewarded by, how many ideas come out from the organization. They really need, they have quarterly results. So you need to connect these ideas, and actually their responsibility is to produce results. And so how do you bridge that gap?
One of the challenges that we face is when we're trying to explain something that's new, there's a high degree of risk and there's a high degree of failure. Whether you're prototyping new products in a traditional design approach, a civilian design approach, or if you're trying out new ideas in a very complex, difficult security context, right? And so our challenge becomes, well, how do we explain this in a new way, and how do we bridge this over? Do we need new language? The flow, and flow is a metaphor, just like all language is metaphoric. When we are unable to realize the metaphors behind and above how we communicate, how we think about reality, the designers aren't able to really challenge themselves. And so we as design facilitators work with the senior leaders to go what we say is above the board. And Philippe, we do this quite a bit whenever we collaborate together, particularly at the Canadian Forces College. And the Joint Special Operations University really looks at when a design team is drawing something, that senior leader has to be able to realize what they're drawing, but also why they are drawing and explaining these things with these metaphors. And challenging them is what can help move an organization past some of the barriers. One quick example was with an organization we worked on counterinsurgency. Most of you have heard of the process. It's defined by a metaphor, winning their hearts and minds, right? So this organization doing design, one small team came up with, well, maybe it shouldn't be that. Maybe it should be winning their hearts, minds, and afterlives. Wow. Suddenly people were throwing chairs. They were getting extremely upset. They were arguing violently. And we as facilitators worked with the senior leader, and we worked into why that was. Why was that a barrier? Why was that off limits? That helped that organization get past that, and that wasn't the technique that they ended up using, but that discussion was essential for them to challenge themselves, disrupt, and move towards new opportunities that were just beyond what the limits of their beliefs were preventing them from even realizing or expressing to one another.
On results, just one thing. I think that design brings, or an innovation brings better results that are more sustainable. The difference is that you don't have an easy way to get there as you would do with traditional methodology. So I think that the main challenge is to try to convince the leader that's like, well, it's not going to be a step-by-step process, I might try to ideate. Tomorrow I might play with Legos, see where this get me, and then I might totally change my way of articulating my problem. But clearly, we are not ready for having an honest discussion like that, but that's how innovation works. Innovation does not work with a step-by-step process.
That requires a lot of courage, I guess. I mean, it's very risky to go out there and disrupt the system. And if you want to hang there, just for a minute, I mean, the planning-based approach, and we have heard that a couple of times even today, it's very linear, but it was, I guess, Henry Mintzberg, who is really the grandfather of the management literature, who comes out in 1998 in the Harvard Business Review, and he says, that the strategic planning as we know it, it's dead. Yeah. And he says, I don't know what comes next, but this one, in and of itself alone, is not working any longer. So how do you work up that courage? How do you overcome those difficulties with the staffers to put your career on the line if you're in the military or even in civilian life? And actually, how do you sort of incentivize risk-taking in others and in yourself?
One of the paradoxes, I think, in military and government organizations is that we have a promotion system that works generally off of convergence and high performance and efficiency, in that everyone who moves through the rank system was the best at converging and demonstrating those talents that the organization wants them to move to the next level and do. But the paradox there becomes, you may have people that are extremely poor at the lower level activities, tactical ones, but they're really good at the strategic. And only in centralized hierarchies where you have this progression process of up and out do you actually lose and eliminate all of your people that don't conform at a lower level, and you may end up with a lot of people that are extremely convergent at a high level. And Imre, you could probably talk a little bit more about this. And that's when suddenly, thou shalt now be creative. And I think that puts our senior leaders at a disadvantage because they've been going through this whole process where they've been told to be the very best at convergence, optimization, and efficiencies, risk reduction. And now they're supposed to be creative, disrupt, and change the organization and bring us to a bold new tomorrow. So how do we do that? How do we help leaders with that? One of the things that we talk with organizations about is you've got to create safe conditions for that design experimentation to occur, especially conceptually. And secondly, you as the senior leader have to be able to shape that risk and manage it. There are no longer end states, and there probably never were. These processes don't really exist, and they never did, except we attempt to use them over and over. So how can you shift off of that? We like to use the metaphor of managing or taking care of a garden, if you will, versus being a football team with a coach trying to get to the end zone. But that's really difficult because, and I'll shift back to you, how much of your professional military education from when you were a cadet, a lieutenant, all the way through to your war college, were you told to get to the end zone, get to the goal?
Yeah, and I see that as I've been progressing. I had a very unconventional mindset throughout my life, and spending most of my time with special forces. And special forces are very different from the normal military because they are trained as guerrillas in order to fight guerrillas and terrorists. So I consider myself to be an unconventional military person. But when I started out my career, this is what I was taught, the doctrine and everything. But when I went to Afghanistan or Iraq, I've seen a lot of young lieutenants and captains evolving in the trenches. And they didn't really throw away the doctrine, but they were adapting the doctrine on the ground. And actually, higher echelons caught up to it. And this kind of emergence we can see a lot in organizations. And in some other examples, when, for example, you're comparing taxis to Ubers, two totally different systems for the same purpose.
The concept of emergence is really difficult. We like to use a lot of complexity language now. It's very popular, but oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, we are moving so quickly as a military organization. We have so many tasks. We have so little time for deep education and learning that we continue to be a solutions-based organization. We take a PowerPoint slide or a quick 2-page paper, and then we attempt to use concepts that really don't match up well with the existing traditional mechanistic decision-making models that are built upon analytic optimization. This is, in our military organizations, we call it military decision-making or the joint operations planning process, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different acronyms, but they all do exactly the same thing. There's some minor doctrinal differences. And the challenge is that when we start inserting emergence, nonlinearity, complexity, chaos, or emergent goals, we then slam them into that same logical analytic process, and we want it to work.
Can I just go back to something that both of you have mentioned, and I think needs a little bit of explaining. So when we were talking about senior leaders, Philippe, you also mentioned psychological safety. Mm-hmm. You didn't really use these exact words, but when you were talking about risk, you mentioned that as well, Ben. What does really psychological safety means to you, Philippe?
Mm-hmm. From my perspective is, let's be honest. I mean, for instance, one of my student, a major, he told me one day, well, I know you'd like us to be more creative and all that, and that's the message that we hear from the government, but I don't think this is really, really honest. I think it's just the flavor of the day. And I try one day to be innovative. I had a great idea, was in Congo, and I brought it to my general. And do you know what he replied to me? Well, it's a bad word, so I cannot really say it there, but it meant to just keep this idea for yourself and never share it again. So that's not what I call, that's the opposite of psychological safety. Psychological safety is to creating the conditions for your employees to share these ideas without retribution, and also listening to them and their concern and all that. So it's really to develop this trust that we were talking about from my perspective.
But that's a military example. So what's the difference between the civilian and the military design? How do you see that?
This is a very controversial subject of which there are very strong opinions. In fact, I just was getting hit up on social media on these concepts. And so what's I think most important is when there's so many people in this room and in different disciplines that talk about the same words. They talk about design, they talk about creativity, they talk about innovation, they talk about disruption, they talk about planning, they talk about newness, as well as efficiencies and increasing their effectiveness, all these things, right? But what we have to do as designers and as leaders, and this is what we advise to leaders, is, well, what is the method that you are doing and why are you doing it? So we get to that meta level. And this is what one term is reflective practice. I prefer that one. So reflective practice is knowing why your organization is doing what it does. And so sometimes when you get frustrated, you say, here we go again. Here we go again, we're doing it again. And when your organization is doing that, you are reflecting on normally something that's negative, right? But you're saying, gosh, why are we still doing this? How do we not realize we're doing this? So there are certain things, the Bin Laden raid will fold back into that. There were lots of rehearsals or rock drills, rehearsal of concept that are done before these operations, and they're absolutely essential. I'm not saying don't do them. We need to. But there's something different with creativity in design, is that you're not rehearsing a concept, you're exploring new ones. You're wiping everything off. There's a great example in the story of McDonald's and how they figured out a new kitchen by drawing out their kitchen on a basketball court and then redrawing it over and over and creating. That's not a rock drill. That's not a rehearsal of a concept. It's exploring new ones. Now, the challenge, though, is how does that senior leader do this? And in civilian design, you have certain methods that do certain things. They have things that they're really good at on all those words we mentioned, creativity, innovation, but there's certain things they're not as good at. But it's hard for the designer to acknowledge it because we want our design, particularly if that's what we were trained in, it's got to do everything. It does it all. Creativity, innovation, efficiency, adaptation, reflective practice, it does it all. But they really don't. You as a senior leader have to recognize, I need this type of design here. I need this type of planning here. This new situation requires a different type of design. And that's a really difficult thing to do because you might be doing the Bin Laden raid tomorrow, or a raid like that, and then next week you're doing something entirely different that isn't a raid, and it requires a completely new way of doing it. And all the rehearsals that you've done are insufficient and probably wrong. And
to make it quickly, I would say the main difference is the context. When you are in a business, well, you usually do it in a state, and there are laws and all that you can rely on. You can use them and sue somebody and whatever. In war, there's not the equivalent. Like it's the most disruptive context ever. So it changes everything. So and the other thing is that, well, in the military, you're technically working for a state. So you gotta honor the vision of the policymaker, the head of state, and ultimately you are, the extension of the will of the population in the democratic country. So I think that's one of the main difference, that it cannot be exactly the same practice if you practice design in a business or in the military.
To close this off, what do you think? Why business should turn back to the good old, ages-old military practices, and can they really use the wisdom? You have worked with elite teams, both of you, and can business leaders simply apply the insights that military teams have? Do you want to say?
Yeah, well, to continue on what I said, I think that they can, but they gotta be really thoughtful about it. They cannot just take something and apply it. Like take, let's say, a piece of a MacBook Pro and put it in a Ferrari. It doesn't work like that. You gotta really make it, see if it fits. So for instance, if we talk about innovation leadership in big organizations, well, you have many similarities that you can use. But there are other things like involving indeed violence where you cannot really use the same thing. Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about this, we're at the methodological level is essentially how you were doing these things. But for a senior leader to think about what type of creativity, innovation, design, whether they're drawing from business or if they're looking at military unique context, they've got to think about exactly what it is they're doing and why they're doing it. And one example we like to use is if you're trying to build a really fast race car, that's very different from building a dump truck that moves dirt and helps with construction. But if your organization doesn't know the difference at the methodological level, as well as that higher level, the why and the how, the reflective practice, your organization might give you a half race car, half dump truck. Instead of a Porsche, it's a Dorsch. And nobody wants to drive a Dorsch, especially you, the senior leader. And you'll say, this isn't what I wanted. Go back out and do it again. And they bring you another Dorsch. This time, it's the other way around. Oh, we got it now. No. And you're going to continue to have your organization do this because it's essentially schizophrenic at a design level, because your organization either is misinformed on what type of design they're doing or what type of planning, or they're trying to combine methods that aren't going towards the same needs that you have because it's at the methodological or maybe just the doctrine or the language level, and you haven't gotten up to that higher practice of, wait a minute, we want increased creativity, which means higher risk, which means we're not going to be able to increase efficiency or flow. We actually have to disrupt and increase a significant amount of risk right now in a careful way, maybe cognitively, which means that instead of coming up with 3 courses of action in our traditional planning processes, and by the way, it's never 3, it's 2, and normally it's just 1, and we get rid of the other or combine them, right? But in design, you've got to come up with thousands of prototypes and rapidly move through those so you can have lots of failure in order to come up with a series of ones that are maybe workable to move and move and move to those new ideas. Those are very different processes. One is a dump truck, and we need dump trucks. But the other is a race car. The senior leader has to navigate between those and guide the organization so you don't end up with a Dorsch.
That's brilliant, and I want to leave you with an idea that builds upon what we just heard, and try to think about that. You know, when are you done innovating? So when you go home tonight and you go to bed, or that brilliant idea just strikes you in the morning when you're in the shower, the journey never ends. Thank you.